Space nerds, what's up? Welcome. I've got a request for a video over the last couple of weeks multiple times. People want a review of what's been going on in Star Citizen the first half of this year. It's kind of crazy. 4.8 caused a lot of trouble. 4.9 was supposed to kind of start fixing it. But I want to make a summary of everything that has happened so that you guys can follow along more easily with what to expect next half of the year. So let's start off in January. In January, I actually published a video about Star Citizen's risky plan for the year. They wanted to keep some of the stability they got in from 2025, which I know wasn't perfect, but it was better than this. They also wanted to get back to adding features, though. We saw this start with engineering in December, LAMP in January. Just in general, things were starting to trickle back in with that same flow as we had in 3.x. This was risky, as I said, but we'll get to why. Now, late January, Alpha 4.6 releases as a kind of a fixer-up patch on 4.5 with a little bit of additions here and there like LAMP, but mostly meant to try and make things feel like they were last year. Cautious optimism all around. The next month in February, Benoit actually got on Star Citizen Live to tell us kind of what his plan was for the year from a technological standpoint in Star Citizen. First up on this list of priorities was bi-monthly updates, something that slowed down the monthly updates we were getting last year, which they admitted was a bit too much for the team. Next up was crafting and inventory, wanting to get into the game relatively quickly, which it was the next month. After that, item recovery tier 1. They wanted to make sure that the things on your ship could get insured so that you could get them back, and there was a little bit more risk of loss, but the ability to get stuff back if you need it. And then, of course, the golden rule, the thing they absolutely need to fix this year, the most important thing that he listed, making sure that players weren't losing things from their inventory, freight elevators, randomly just things disappearing for you. Kinda sucks. This also was hand in hand with the forward migration idea of items going from one patch to the next when they drop an update on you without you ever knowing it's coming. Those not wiping out your items in between patches. Now, unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, y'all have seen your materials wiped out, so crafting has taken a big hit, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but as you can see, this has not quite been figured out. And then finally, my favorite part. Y'all know I love this. The social tools are meant to be getting updates this year. 4 pillars: the comlink replacement, regional chat, party finder, and org tool. This would also come with the VoIP overhaul, but in general, this was meant to make it easier for people to get together and play the game, which would have been really useful for tactical strike groups, which came out just a couple months later. Nothing on that yet. He also updated us on the instance manager that would help them get things like Siege of Orison and Municipal Works into the game, which we're still waiting for. Although it is in the tech preview, so players are getting a chance to test it. And he also talked about an exploit strike team, meant to try and get rid of the exploits that were giving people a ton of money and creating inflation that made the store basically have you buying a fried rat for the same price as like a nuclear reactor, essentially. Now, I'm going to be honest, I have not heard that much about exploits lately. Either it's not the hot topic that's fun to talk about for most people, or maybe they have had an impact on it over the last few months. I'm not sure, but take of that what you will. The last thing we learned during that show was that all of the CitizenCon Direct stuff from 2025 was scheduled for 26. So at least as of that show, we're still expecting Nix 1 and the Municipal Works to join this year with all the other content we've seen. Now, moving on to March, Alpha 4.7 was launched, the follow-up to 4.6, keeping that 2-month cadence. They marketed it as the crafting patch, but the mining rework kind of took all of the flame. That being said, missions were fairly unstable, and the game was not feeling as good as it did last year. Both crafting and engineering at this point hadn't proven themselves, especially engineering, which had kind of fallen into the background for most people, which I think we all said was probably going to happen. But crafting also came in and didn't include a lot of industrial stuff, a lot of ship-based items, so it was only halfway there. But we'll come back to that. In April, I got hold of the financial documents for CIG from 2024. I then invited a finance VP onto the podcast where we discussed the numbers. We talked about a put option that investors had on CIG exercisable from January to September 30th of 2026 for up to £71 million. We talked about the fact that their wages had exceeded their income for that year and that their tax credits had actually helped them to keep things in the green because of that. And while the biggest thing that we talked about here was the put option, it was interesting to see that the mention of money being pulled from Star Citizen to Squadron 42, which was in the financial reports of 2023, had disappeared from 2024. I think we can still feel the pressure, but at least internally it seems they want to start to spread out the love. Now, jumping forward a little bit from there, in mid-April, CIG quietly canceled Squadron 42 buybacks. Basically, anybody who had a copy of Squadron 42 in their buybacks, melted but able to be bought back so they could get it, couldn't do that anymore. There was no announcement, no warning, nothing from CIG. Even their own community employee didn't know about it. This was a chance for them to undercut the gray market, but more importantly, this was kind of the first major thing we were seeing in terms of movement for Squadron 42 and, a possible point towards marketing starting. Now, it was around that time that CIG went to the Level Up Expo, where they were inviting different people into their massive booth. You can see how big it is here behind Xylo here. Massive booth full of people playing the game. This is actually a pretty big World of Warcraft content creator they invited to come sit down and play. He did an interview. He talked about it in front of his fans. It felt like it was being marketed to a much different crowd. And the interesting thing about this is that they actually only allowed people to play Arena Commander back here. Now, obviously, that makes sense. You don't have the time to get into the PU and get stuck in, but it definitely lets them give people a different idea of how the game performs than what the PU might have been doing in April during 4.7. But at this same time, we saw that an article had come out from SkillUp's crew, This Week in Video Games, and they had interviewed Chris actually back in February. It was only then being published. But in this interview, Chris specifically called out 2026 still as the year that they were targeting to release Squadron 42. There were plenty of other things being talked about in this article, but I want to point that out specifically because of what we're going to get to in a little bit. It was also around this time in April, though, that I was talking with the Astropub on my podcast, and we kind of came across the realization that they were slowly shifting away from patch bundles and concept ship sales over to monthly bundles. Now, we know they were not doing concept ship sales anymore, with the Odin being the last one in May, but this seemed like a real effort to spread out the love throughout the year from just May and November to make sure every single month had something that players wanted to buy, more than just, I don't know, a gun. What it allowed them to do was take a new flyable ship, package it with potentially some small item, weapon, or armor, and sell them together for an inflated price that has seemed to stabilize their months a little bit more. We'll see if this does succeed long term, but it definitely shows that they're trying to spread out their monetization for the game. More regular funding models, no more concept sales, more cosmetics and packs and monthly drops that they could get a lot more money from if they can expand their player base, rather than expensive ships for a smaller amount of people. Now we jump forward to May, where 4.8 dropped. Now, this looked like one of the biggest patches of ever, at least on paper. It had real progression, it had blueprints. Blueprints were being rewarded for everything that you did, whether it was industrial, combat-focused, mining, salvage. It felt good to get rewarded in-game for something you did in-game based on your performance in-game. On top of that, item recovery tier 1 was kind of beginning with ships. It was one of the big things Benoit had talked about. It was something that had started a year back, and we were waiting for them to kind of remove it so people could loot again. And to see it starting with ships was a bit of a bummer, but it felt like good progress. And then, of course, the Ironclad. One of the most hyped ships in years for Star Citizen. 2 years after the date of its introduction, it was landing in players' hands, and it was a really big marketing campaign for it. This was DefenseCon. Always happens in May. Usually it's called Invictus Week. This year it was taken over by Drake, so they themed it for themselves. But this is arguably the biggest moment of the year for Star Citizen, at least funding-wise. And funding-wise, I can show you here, they made more money in this May than they made in the entire year of 2018. And in 2018, this game was already pretty kind of far along, at least in people knowing about it. This was late into the project, so they're making more in a month than they were making during relatively good years back then. The funding showed up, but if you look at the new player count, it did not. DefenseCon, specifically this one, but Invictus Week in general, is marketed hard towards new players, and it completely failed to work in just the first few days of this update. There were so many people I saw who wanted to introduce their friends to the game for the first time here, or were jumping into the game for the first time in May, and completely bounced off, and I don't know if they'll ever be back. And I think CIG had the chance to fix this. In those first few days when everything was just not working out, Jared got on camera, told us that things were going wrong, and publicly said that a delay was going to happen for the Free Fly event until the game was in a better position. CIG pushed out the Free Fly a few days later anyways. Bad communication, bad decision. Ultimately, this was the turning point for Star Citizen so far this year. It was a little bumpy for the first part of the year, but this made players really take a step back and think, maybe they can't build the game while also keeping it somewhat stable. Ultimately, it gave them the lowest account signups in 4 years of hosting Invictus Week, despite the biggest patch of the year so far, potentially one of the biggest patches ever, despite all the marketing pushing new players in, despite all the funding. It was a failure. And after that, we got 2 weeks of silence. No real explanations of what was happening. We did see the Odin go on sale for $5,000 as a concept image. We also saw CIG pass the $1 billion mark in funding. Now, if you know CIG, you know Chris loves to give his letter from the chairman. Generally, it would happen anytime we passed major funding milestones, but in the later years, it started to happen when we were reaching tech milestones or towards the end of the year. Now, we did get one at the end of 2025, but usually, or at least sometimes, we might get one towards the middle of the year if something big is happening. And this year, we did not. As the game passed $1 billion in funding, nothing was said to the community about it, but an article was released to Variety to celebrate it and to do a little bit of, I think, getting ahead of the news that Squadron 42 was still not having any announcements about it. In fact, in this article, you can see Chris Roberts said that it was in its closing stages. Remember, I went back to that other article we saved where he said that it was coming 2026. This is a definitive change in the words they're using to describe the release date of this game, and I'm not going to draw too many conclusions from it, but it does seem like they're still hedging on possibly not making it at the end of this year. And let's be real, it's getting late. Now, by June 11th, we were actually back to the regular swing of things, at least in terms of ships. The Alien Week ship sales had started. The Gattac Raylan and the Tylenol were released as a cargo hauler and a small ship carrier. These are relatively celebrated ships, and people actually really like the Raylan design, but they landed in the middle of a broken game with little communication, and I think overall, probably could have had a much better reception. Which brings us to June 18th, the intervention. Jared was joined by the CTO and the gameplay engineering director to talk about the state of the game, what they wanted to do to fix it, and why they hadn't really been talking just yet. They talked about the star map, quantum routing, the Idris making the game crash constantly, intentionally live exploits they were still trying to get rid of, insurance and imprinting problems. It was pretty bad, and Benoit actually came out and basically said that they could not keep up with the cadence of updates they were pushing out or features they were adding while keeping the game stable. Something that had become apparent to everybody, but also something I don't think anybody's really been able to say about CIG just yet, which makes it feel a little bit different. But the most important takeaway from this whole talk was that they were bringing senior leadership more into the bug fixing process. They were trying to target root cause bug fixing rather than going after the symptoms, and they wanted to make sure that that first hour of gameplay was actually satisfying and not crappy because of the problems. Can they make it happen? We're all just going to sit here and wait to see it before we believe it, I know. But that does bring us to the next roadmap roundup happening in early July. 4.9 was gutted. They had moved most of the features out of it, including the big addition of instancing, into 4.10, which they're putting in August. So it allows them to keep somewhat of that 2-month patch cadence, but they are putting an extra patch in August and just naming it 4.10 instead. So that's when we'll be seeing instancing. Funny thing about this is that instancing was the first 1.0 card to move into the active roadmap that I've seen or noticed in a big way, and that's a really big deal. Unfortunately, it's pushed back a month. Hopefully that does help the stability of the game. Now, before all this happened in late June, I want to step back for a bit, CIG actually started sending letters out to different people in the community. Turns out they were throwing a hands-on event in Manchester in October for people to come and actually play Squadron 42. A lot of folks had different reasons for why people were getting these invites and who it was limited to, but in general, speculation was surrounding the idea that this maybe was a mini CitizenCon because they couldn't afford to do a whole CitizenCon, a marketing event where they were inviting journalists and content creators, or just a way to celebrate the community. I think kind of it might be a combination of all three, but it's definitely not a media event. It is meant for the community itself, and it feels very internal as a way to celebrate and have CitizenCon without being able to throw a whole CitizenCon. So I guess a little bit of all three. This has been the only communication we've had about Squadron 42 since 2024. and they still say it's supposed to come out this year, which I think less and less people are believing at this point. CIG did say they want to do a short marketing campaign, but the window is closing fast with big games coming, Ace Combat in October, GTA in November, December just not really being a great time to release a game. The advertising costs and the general noise in the community is going to be higher during this fall. So the fact that this is the only communication we've gotten both feels like CIG telling us, hey, there is something going on, but also not really wanting to tell us possibly the game is delayed or anything else. But now here we are, mid-July, 4.9 just came out, and to be honest, it is a slight step up from 4.8, but it's not the greatest. I was actually just running bunkers in it a couple days ago, and the NPC enemies weren't even spawning with clothes. So your mileage may vary, but I think if you were skipping 4.8, 4.9 is probably not going to be good enough to bring you back. They brought in a new ship, the Basher, there's a new weapon, the CQ-7, some small enemy behavior changes for the Valakar that I could not get to work in PTU. In general, it is 4.8 with a little bit of improvement. I think this is going to be the kind of cycle of fixing that goes on for a lot of time. This needs to be a fundamental philosophical shift for CIG. They can't just fix what's wrong with the game in one patch or two patches. They need to get to the root causes, they need to change their testing structure, and they need to use the technical preview more like they've been doing with instancing. Because as of right now, confidence in Squadron 42, fairly low. People are waiting for some kind of official word beyond, it's coming soon. Is it gonna be at Gamescom? I think that'd be a perfect time to delay it, but we'll see what they do. Stability in 4.9 is not the greatest. It's better than 4.8, but still not back to what people were expecting from things like 4.4 or other patches last year. 4.8 had a pretty big effect on the game. 4.9 and 4.10 are supposed to fix it, but as of now, I think players are still waiting to see it. Number 3, features aren't showing up in the tech preview channel, I think, as much as anybody was hoping. I would hope that we were seeing some stuff that was coming in 4.10 and 4.11 in the tech preview right now. Now, we are seeing instancing, which is good, but instancing is like the most important thing, so that's kind of expected. If there were any other changes coming down the line, like item recovery for our weapons rather than for ship parts, I would hope that's in the tech preview right now as well. And that does bring me to the 4th point. Instancing is a pretty important part of this year. I know it's a very debated part of what's happening with Star Citizen, but it is super important. From mission givers to story beats to just making sure the game is more stable. Clearly, they need to get instancing working, so the jury's still out on how that's going to go, but I think the success of that is going to be a big determiner of how this year's actually gone. As I said, as of right now, 4.9 is relatively stable to the point where you can play it. A lot more missions are working for me than in 4.7 in terms of I can complete them, but like I showed you, the enemies I was shooting weren't even spawning with clothes, so you're still going to have issues. I've heard that cargo is not loading currently in freight elevators, so cargo has been kind of destroyed. But this maintenance that's been going on this week, maybe it'll help. I haven't gotten to play yet, but I'll have an update for you by the end of the week. CIG actually, right after I recorded this, did say that they were going to move forward with the ship showdown next week. So that's the end of July, which previously it hadn't happened that early. It usually happens in August. So I'm pretty sure this is them closing that gap because the Foundation Festival has ended and they do need to kick off a new event. Probably means that the ship showdown will be a little longer than it normally is. Nonetheless, it's starting sooner. For now, this has been your Half 1 2026 recap. I left out quite a bit, but this should give you a pretty big picture of where we're at right now. If you'd like more, honestly, I'm posting here almost every day with what's going on with this game almost every day. So thanks for checking it out. Hope you enjoyed this deep dive into what's been happening. Catch you in the next one.